Henceforth, I will create Guild Wars 2 content. What kind of Guild Wars 2 content? The bad kind of Guild Wars 2 content, and the good kind of Guild Wars 2 content, and every kind of Guild Wars 2 content from the spectrum in between. The red kind of Guild Wars 2 content, and the blue kind of Guild Wars 2 content, and every kind of Guild Wars 2 content from the spectrum in between. The male kind of Guild Wars 2 content, and the female kind of Guild Wars 2 content. All kinds of Guild Wars 2 content. Well, this is to say, henceforth am I a Guild Wars 2 content creator. So, let's get to the most important topic of the day, which is Guild Wars 2's most latest news about the Bladesworn. It's over to my other voice for more details about the Bladesworn and its new weapon, the Gun Saber.
Gun Saber attacks enhance the Bladesworn.
Bladesworn. Gun Saber. Bladesworn. Gun Saber. Blade. Saber. Blade. What's the deal there? Why didn't they just call it a gun blade like everyone else does? You know, there's a really cool saying I heard the other day. It compares making useless changes, which are changes made for the sake of the change rather than to serve a purpose or to advance technology. It compares that endeavor to reinventing the wheel. Now, the wheel, of course, is very, very old technology. It's some of the oldest ever. And it served us pretty well so far in human history, to the point that we still use it, you know, unlike even something like chalk, which as far as writing implements go is pretty recent, but it's still been, by and large, replaced with whiteboards and markers. And what that means, as far as I can tell, is that there's no point, really, in trying to create another tool that is as efficient as the wheel, that so simplifies transportation. And in fact, the only way that you could create a tool, any tool, that is comparable to the wheel in the first place is to create a wheel, is to reinvent it. In other words, you come to the same conclusion, but by a different method. More importantly, as it applies to what I've been talking about, by a different name. Blade. Saber. Blade. Now, maybe I could lay off of Guild Wars 2's developers, let them off the hook for reinventing the wheel, if the shift from Gun Blade to Gun Saber actually matched the name of its wielder. That is, if they called him a Saber Sworn. And in fact, I would have given them extra points for the alliteration. I think that's a cooler name. But it's not Saber Sworn. The user of the Gun Saber is actually called the Blade Sworn. So yeah, that's about as bad as you can make it. You know, that's like if the Emperor from Star Wars ruled over the Galactic Kingdom. No, it's not the kingdom, it's the bloody Empire. The Empire strikes back. The Imperial March. You know, they carried that through to every element, and that makes it a cohesive and natural part of the story. You don't sit back and question going, why did they... No, it's the Emperor, it's the Empire, it's the Imperial March. Same thing if the Fire Nation was led by the Flame Lord. No, he's Fire Lord Ozai. Come on. Cohesion is important. And in fact, I'd say the only reason that you flavor whatever cheap gameplay gimmicks you create every single expansion cycle with names and titles and animations and special effects and all this other crap is for this point of cohesion. So you feel like you're not just playing the UI in a complicated number game. You know, you're not just the personal calculator for this abstract entity of numbers and stats that you then have to pit against other abstract entities of numbers and stats, and then you try your best to multiply the damage per second that you do with different traits and builds and modifiers and all that kind of nonsense. Be not deceived. Just because the game is telling you this is how you ought to play the game doesn't mean that's what the system is inherently designed for. No, there's something greater that ultimately the game can't satisfy you on, and so it will happily try and distract you from the fact that it lacks in that significant department. The beauty of wrapping this abstract stat sheet into a single coherent being that is embodied in a virtual world is that it has a face, is that it has a story, is that it has a blade that you can actually swing around.
I swung a sword. I swung a sword again. Hey, I swung it again. That's great.
You're supposed to be playing his role in the game. And you know, that's kind of the point of a role-playing game. You aren't simply supposed to be crunching out numbers until they are as large as possible. Now, we've actually stumbled on a very important and a very deep question that pertains not only to game design, but I would say the perception of reality itself, which is to what degree of abstraction can we actually pull out details from the world until it becomes unrecognizable? Or in fact, do we simply focus more on the abstraction instead of what it's supposed to be representing? You know, when I launched Guild Wars 2 content on my channel, I devoted myself to making bad Guild Wars 2 content, and unfortunately this question is so good that answering it qualifies as good content. So as to this question of whether immersion is even possible when you're working with a system that is this numerically involved, I can't answer that question for you, but we can talk about a much more trivial and useless question, which is about cohesion in naming things. So, as far as I can tell, there's two ways to fix this Blade Sworn crisis. And both of these I've already hinted at. One of them is to call his weapon a gun blade, which it is. And that's a pretty easy solution. The other is to call him a saber sworn, which he is. And that's a pretty easy solution. But it's the third solution of the three that I've hinted at that is the most interesting. And that's to capitalize on the alliteration of saber sworn. But instead of saber, we use another word for a long, sharp, metallic implement classically used as a weapon in pre-modern warfare. That's a sword. A sword sworn. Well, now you see the alliteration is 4 letters deep in a pair of words that are 5 letters long. And this makes the alliteration so much deeper, so much more profound. It adds to the cohesion. It's like poetry. The way these letters keep repeating and keep reappearing in this wordplay. There's intent and playfulness and passion. In fact, I was so inspired by the sword sworn that I wrote a poem to reflect what the sword sworn could have been. I love nothing more than my sword. To her I have pinky promise sworn. I swing her with a swingy swirl. Whirl, 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 whirl. The only problem with sword sworn remains its difficulty to pronounce, whence I predict that the player base will end up calling it the SS. What a terrible acronym for a marketable feature. Reminds me of that tragedy. Yes, it reminds us of that tragedy. Some people wouldn't mind that because they see it as a sort of payback. We are reclaiming a simple acronym from an evil force. Recall Pepe the Frog and the OK hand gesture, not to mention, of course, the swastika, of particular interest to me as my parents are Hindus. Much has been made of the fact that benign things like these were lost to us because they were made into white supremacy symbols without any sort of fight or clarification on the matter. People have rightly said that simply handing cultural symbols and gestures, no matter how trivial, over to neo-Nazis and white supremacists isn't a very wise move, because the more inches you give, the more miles they'll take, until great swaths of our culture are untouchable, so to speak, since they supposedly belong to the white supremacists. In my opinion, it's not really a lack of wisdom that causes the media and the popular consensus to casually hand over cultural trivialities to this great evil, but instead it's a lot more insidious. By painting larger and larger parts of the culture as white supremacist, eventually they can get away with fear-mongering that significant parts of the culture are entirely bent towards white supremacy. And anyone associated with those parts of the culture are white supremacists, regardless of what they actually believe, until they can even point at a black man and call him a white supremacist. With this fear in place, it's not so difficult to ask the common man to give his freedom and his power up to a benevolent tyranny that will promise to wash away the evil. Then, knowing his power is based upon the presence and the fear of that evil, the new tyrant will suddenly find that this evil has become ineradicable, because somehow it has gone underground, or it is integral to the history of the nation. So he will demand equally ineradicable power to fight it, continually, until he holds supreme power and the tyranny is complete. Unless you are comfortable with a tyrannical state of affairs, it's not wise to let cultural artifacts, whether it's Pepe or even historical statues, be demonized one way or another, and especially in today's society as white supremacist. I would say it is diabolical. Abiding by the etymology of Diablo, actions of this nature only cause great divisions in our society. People can be, and often are, evil. But images, symbols, works of art, are only imbued with the context and the message we give them. And of course, as is always the case with art, this goes both ways. If the message, we insist, from our culture is one of fear, hate, destruction, and evil, then being surrounded by it, we will find ourselves becoming more and more fearful, hating, destructive, and evil people. The opposite, then, is to interpret our past with courage over fear, with love to those who hate us, by rebuilding what is destroyed, and by acknowledging that an objective goodness exists, so we may take the side against evil. Which brings us back to the acronym of SS. How appropriate it is that we are normalizing and taking back these symbols from the very forces of evil that we are told to be so afraid of. That the culture and the past they idolize can be so cheap and silly that the same letters have become more meaningful as an acronym in a video game. Do not confuse me. I am not saying that the price of defeating the regime that hosted the SS was cheap, but rather, in their defeat, our enemy has also lost the ability to refer to it with any dignity.
With Hitler, the more I learn about that guy, the more I don't care for him.
This is another reason why I dislike the recent rejuvenation in condemning so-called white supremacy. If it were real white supremacy, then what care have I? Condemn away. However, in calling anyone across the political aisle literally Hitler, in creating hate crimes against oneself because the demand for racism outweighs its supply in the modern West, in insisting that helpful, polite, and mature behaviors such as working hard, playing fair, being on time, observing logic, reason, and even reality are unique symptoms of a paler skin color, and that therefore these behaviors must be dismantled for the sake of racial equity. In these condemnations I have no interest, or rather, the interest I have for them is in vehemently opposing them. The reverence or fear given to the bogeymen of neo-Nazis and white supremacists is so over the top that the small number of these petty and pathetic scum still present would be emboldened by the attention. And indeed, even if not a person held these reprehensible beliefs, white supremacy of a type has resurrected in the modern day. The name of it is treated with such dignity by those who say they fight against it, and whiteness is treated as such a superpower by the same people that I can think of no other way to describe their beliefs except as white supremacy. I have once again departed from the main point, which is, there may be the unfortunate consequence that you overhear a group of people who share a fondness of the SS, but when you jump in and say that you prefer the SB, the DH, or the DD, you find that they were in fact talking about the Schutzstaffel, and so you are beat up to the tune of For the Everlasting Fourth Reich, Heil Hitler, and other such nonsense. But much more likely in the near future, if our society finds some sense anyway, and Guild Wars 2's developers learn to name things properly, you will find a group of punkish, rebellious youths with swastikas tattooed upon their bald heads yelling shamelessly about their love of the SS. And when you tell them how reprehensible and immoral they are to turn away from their neo-nationalist views, they will say you are a buffoon, or at least a Ranger main, and to go back to playing RuneScape like the child that you are. Should this insult stir your anger, they will apologize and peaceably chant Jai Gurudeva Om at you. But all this aside, the Blade Sworn will probably be acronymized as BS, which at least fits in much better with the current state of Guild Wars 2. End of Dragons coming this February. Purchase it from the referral link in the description. Well, if you have taste and found this video to be a waste of time, then we have fulfilled our promise to make the bad kind of Guild Wars 2 content, so be sure to hit that like button and support this Guild Wars 2 content channel. If you have the sudden urge to make a sandwich, then we fulfilled our promise to make the female kind of Guild Wars 2 content, so be sure to hit that like button and support this Guild Wars 2 content channel. But if somehow you enjoyed this video, then God help you.